Hey there guys, and welcome back. On this week's show, we're going to be making a simple utility case. Well, if you remember a while back on the show, we made a game of 12 pins, and which is a fun game to play outdoors in the summertime. And if you're interested in that, I'll put a link below for that particular show. But what I need for this game is I need a case, because it's kind of unruly carrying the pieces around in a bag. It's just kind of a pain in the neck, so I decided that I would make a case for it. And what I had in mind was almost like a wooden briefcase. Now it's going to be a simple build, but it all starts off with measuring what you need for the size. Now all of the pieces of this game are the same size, with the exception of the throwing pin. And I kind of thought that in the case, if they mount it like this, 45 to 45, it would make it so that the case would not have to be so long. Or, you know, it could reduce the size of it if we maximize the space inside. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay out all of these pieces in the configuration that I want them on the inside of the box, and once I get that done, I'm going to take a few measurements. So I'm thinking that this will be the best configuration to place the pieces into the case. So then if I take the measurements for that, to give myself a little bit of wiggle room, it looks like the interior dimensions need to be 10.5 by 14 inches. So we're going to go with that for the interior measurements, 10.5 by 14. Now we have those measurements, and it's all fine and well to say that it's 10.5 by 14, but those are the interior dimensions. Now how do you figure out the length of your piece? Well, what type of joinery are you going to be using? And in my case, we're going to be using finger jointing or box joints. So because of that, we need to add the thickness of the material onto each end of our interior dimensions. Now we're going to be making this out of 1/2 inch plywood, which means that we have to add a 1/2 inch to each side of both dimensions, which would be an inch. 1/2 inch and 1/2 inch is an inch. So instead of 10.5 by 14, the pieces that we cut for their length needs to be 11.5 by 15 to allow for the thickness of our material. The other thing that you want to consider is how deep the box is going to be. And for us, these dowels for the game of 12 pins are 2 inches in diameter. So we will be giving ourselves a little bit of wiggle room, and we'll be making the interior 2.25 inches deep. So we're going to start with that, which will be the walls of the box of our case. So we're going to need 2 pieces that are 2.25 inches wide. They're going to be 15 inches long, and then we need 2 pieces that are going to be 1/2 inch thick plywood, 2.25 inches wide by 11.5 inches long. Well, with the pieces cut for the walls of the box, we now need to do the jointing of it. And I've chosen finger joints. Now, you don't need to do finger joints. If you want, you can do miters, you could do butt joints, you could do half laps, you can do whatever you want here. It is your project. I chose finger joints just because I have the INCRA jig and I want to play with it. So that's the only reason. With that being said, I'm going to head to the table saw. I'm going to do all the jointing on this, and once I get that finished up, I'm going to come back and show you where we're at that point in time. we'll just dry fit this case together to make sure that everything fits right. Just like that. And it looks good. I mean, the finger joints are nice and clean, and you can see that with our measuring, we've given ourselves that little bit of slack up here at the top and a tiny little bit side to side just to give us that little bit of wiggle room. You don't want them too tight, and if you didn't want them rattling around in there with that extra little 1/4 inch, then you could always put some weather stripping in there to help pad them. But now it's time to measure and cut our tops and our bottoms, and we're not going to do anything fancy here. All we need to do, or all I want to do, is just measure the dimensions, and we're going to cut some 1/2 inch plywood that will sit directly on top of both the top and the bottom sides of the case. Nothing fancy here. Well, now that we have the top and the bottom cut, it's really not rocket science here. It's a very simple procedure. We're going to be using a little brush, and I've got a cup of glue, and we're going to be getting glue into each one of these finger joints. We're going to glue the whole thing together, and then we're going to glue it onto one, either the top or the bottom. Doesn't matter which right now, neither one has been designated yet. But we're going to glue this all together, leaving it like an open box, clamp it all up, and let that dry. Now that you have it clamped up, just go around and clean up the squeeze out as best you can. Once you get that side glued up and the glue is dry, you can remove your clamps and then glue the other side on the top of the box. And now that you've got it unclamped, give the entire thing a sanding all over. Well, now that you have everything sanded up, it is time to separate the top from the bottom. But the question is, where do you separate it? And the honest answer is, really, you don't have a choice. It's not up to you. It's up to your hardware to make that decision. So I'm just going to have a look here with my hardware and lay it out on the case and see where the best place would be to separate these two halves. Once you get them aligned, take a measurement where the middle of the hinge pin will be, and that's where you're going to cut it. Well, after looking at my hinges and aligning them where I thought I wanted them to go, it looks like I will be setting the fence of my table saw at 1 1/8 of an inch to cut along the hinge pin line of my hinges. There are a lot of people that are intimidated by this particular process, and as long as you're careful and you're using a riving knife, you should be just fine. What you want to do is set the height of your blade to be just a little more than the thickness of your material. So in this case I've got it set a little higher than 1/2 inch. And we're going to do 4 passes. with our fence set at that 1 1/8 of an inch. So we're going to run a pass and then rotate it 90 degrees each time until we're cut all the way through. So now we can clamp this all back into the vise, line up all of our sides now that they're cut apart, and then from there we just line up our hinges to where we want them, square everything up, do a little bit of drilling of pilot holes, and get your hinges mounted on the back side of your case. Well, now that the hinges are on, we can move forward with putting the rest of the hardware on, but you can see now where we have the case here. So I'm going to mount the clasps and the handle, and once we get that done, we're pretty much finished. I think the last thing that I want to do is soften up all of those outer square edges on the case. So I think just a light hand sanding will do the trick with that. I was going to go with a 1/8 round over, but then I thought, do I really want something that harsh? It is just a utility case, and I thought hand sanding will be fine. So hand sand all of your sharp edges around the outside of the case just to soften them a little bit. So we have softened up all of those edges to give us a nice soft edge. I'm going to give this here a sanding as well in the inside of the box, and maybe just soften up these edges just a touch, not much. But it's time now to give the test fit of our 12 pins game. Well, its previous home was in this bag, and that wasn't really working for me, so that's where the whole project idea of this case comes into play. And you can see by the way that we measured it at the beginning of the show that it's paid off as far as the way that this fits. We do have that little bit of a gap like what we planned for, and as I said, I may add some weather stripping around the outside of the case just to sort of keep it from knocking around. But there you go. It's a heck of a lot better than the way I had it stored before, just in a bag. Nice and safe and easy to take with you when you're ready to go play. And there you have it. A finger jointed utility case. Guys, this project was, for me anyway, a lot of fun, and it's also a pretty useful one that I'm sure you could find a ton of uses for around your house or your shop, whether it be for something like a tool that was orphaned from a case because that case got ruined at a job site, or whether it be something like this where you have a game that you carried around and it needed something better to house it. But it's one of those projects as well that's not super fine woodworking, and it has a lot of, let's just say, a lot of room for expansion on the way things should be as far as making mistakes. It's very forgiving. The ability to be able to mount the top just flat, jointed top and bottom, glued and clamped together, makes it a very easy and accessible project for a lot of people with a lot of very different skill levels. So guys, this is a project that you may want to add to your arsenal of things to try. And again, it could build up those skills. Now, whether or not you want to do the finger joints, or you could do miter joints, you could do dovetails, whatever you want to do, that's fine. This is not set in stone. I did finger joints because I could, and I think it's fun for me. But that was what I was going for. You could paint these cases. You could cover them in material. You could add padding to the inside. You could add custom inserts, that sort of thing. It is absolutely limitless, guys. So it's one that you might want to consider. Guys, I want to thank you for joining me again this week. It's been a lot of fun, and I hope to see you again next week here for yet another woodworking video. Just a little extra note, on the bottom of the case I added 4 white feet here. The color doesn't matter, it's what I had in the shop. Reason I added those was so that when you sit it down while carrying it, it can sit flat on the floor without the hinges scratching up the floor. Gives it something to stand up. Just something you may want to consider if you want to use your case that way. Thanks again, guys. See you next week.